everyone, welcome to today's webinar where we're going to be talking about the link of supplier management and contract management, a very popular topic as been shown by the numbers who have registered for this particular program. And our agenda, once we've gone through the introductions, we're going to give a brief point of view from IACCM, and then we're going to have perspectives coming from Determiner and Protiviti to really expand on that question of what is the way that organizations today are establishing that solid link between the various relationships, trading relationships they have, and the contract management activity from a process perspective and a technology perspective. And we'll then be moving into talking about some particular examples and case studies. As I mentioned before, we get to the Q&A section. So plenty of material today, a lively and action-packed program. And who is it that's going to be talking to you today? Well, let's just have a quick look at our roster of speakers. I am Tim Cummins from IACCM, and we'll talk in a moment about the nature of IACCM and its background, but joined today by Chris Monk, Managing Director of Protiviti. And Chris, I think you're sitting in India today. I'm in Australia. Constantine, as far as I know, you're somewhere wandering the United States on a busy election day. So I guess we're a good example between us of the global economy. So Chris, as I said, in India and from Protiviti, and Constantine bringing us perspectives from Determine, where he's Vice President of Product Marketing. So with that, let's get straight into some of the content here and just give you a little bit of background about the nature of the organizations in part, but I think also some important background in terms of why we're speaking to you. So IACCM, as many of you will be, I'm sure, aware, is a non-profit organization. We have somewhere in excess of 40,000 members today, representing more than 15,000 organizations around the world, some 160 countries. Clearly an illustration of the growing importance and recognition that contract management has as a business discipline. No matter where you are in the world, whether you're a private or public sector, there is this understanding and belief increasingly that contract management makes a fundamental difference to competitiveness, to discipline, and of course to critical areas such as regulatory compliance. But I think we've moved a long way from that compliance mentality into one that is increasingly recognizing that this is in fact about delivering business value. And it's very much with that in mind that IACCM's work is undertaken as the lead body for research in the field of contract and commercial management, as well as globally providing training, certification, capability benchmarks, and a wide variety of advisory services. So that's, I think, plenty about us. So let me pass over to Chris or Constantine just to give us a little bit of background. First of all, Chris, to you about Protiviti.
Thanks, Tim. Good morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you might be joining from. Again, this is Chris Monk, Managing Director with Protiviti. As Tim said, I'm joining from Delhi, India. I want to give a brief overview and the obligatory infomercial of Protiviti, but first I start with a very brief and funny story. I was speaking with my 9-year-old daughter about an hour ago, and where it's in the morning on Tuesday, and she asked me, in the part of the world that I'm in, if the election was over, and if so, who won? Found that rather comical, regardless of your affiliation. It certainly talks to the significance of the election today. So with that, just briefly about Protiviti. We're approaching our 15th year anniversary next May, with our roots coming out of Arthur Andersen. Protiviti is a global consulting organization. We offer a full spectrum of finance, technology, operations, and governance services across all industries. Specifically, our business performance improvement practice offers solutions related to financial performance management, capital projects, restructuring and litigation, as well as supply chain. We're a wholly owned subsidiary of Robert Half, currently in about 20 countries with over 70 offices worldwide and revenues approaching about $800 million US. We've been widely recognized as a top company to work for, as well as a top company to launch a career, and have been acknowledged by many of the analyst firms around our thought leadership and leading service offerings. Constantine?
Thank you, Chris. This is Constantine Limbarakis, VP of Product Marketing here at Determine. I'm actually joining you here from Chicago, and as an organization, Determine, we partner with leading organizations like Protiviti and the non-for-profit organizations like IACCM to bring you and sponsor this webinar today. So we're very happy to have both these gentlemen on the call. As an organization, we are a global company focused on solving real-world problems for contract management and source-to-pay practitioners. And as an organization, we have deep roots in contract management, where we work with clients all over the world to really solve the challenges of contract and commercial management, as well as source-to-pay. Recognized by the analyst community, as you can see, we provide our technology and services to tens of thousands of enterprise users around the world, and our goal as a company that is publicly traded, our goal is a simple yet ambitious one, is to really empower enterprises and the users of our solutions using our interconnected and modular platform for improving the vision, insight, and control that is so important and critical for enterprises today. And as it pertains to our topic of connecting supplier management, contract management, that couldn't be ever more true, and why we're talking today to you folks joining us all over the world. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass this back to Tim to give us some of the perspectives from the IACCM and some of the research that they do that's so important in this field. So Tim?
Yeah, thank you, Constantine. Well, I mentioned in the introduction that the importance of contract management as a business discipline, as an organizational discipline, is more and more being recognized, and perhaps there was no better or greater recognition of that than in the very recent last month's award of the Nobel Prize for Economics to two professors, Professor Holmstrom, Professor Hart, for their respective work on contracts. And indeed, it's the second time in 7 years that the Nobel Prize for Economics has been awarded for work on contracts. Now, that's important from a number of perspectives, but I particularly, of course, reflect today on the opening statement from the awarding committee of the Nobel Prize, where they made the observation the world is held together by innumerable contracts. And of course that has a number of, I think, fascinating implications as we look at words in that statement. Firstly, the world. This is a global phenomenon and a global need. Held together represents the point that actually when you have this complex spaghetti of contracts, somehow or other you, or rather this complex spaghetti of relationships, trading relationships, it somehow has to be given sense and cohesion and order. And contracts do represent that cohesion and that order, that global communication medium that brings discipline, that brings certainty, that brings also the realization or not of the economic opportunity that was intended. So the other perspectives and points here are, firstly, that this is a further confirmation of the point that contracts are first and foremost economic instruments, not legal instruments, not control instruments. They're economic instruments. We get into contract because we want to achieve economic benefit from them. And then, of course, we get to the question of, all right, so we've got all these contracts lying around, but the question is, how effective are they at holding us together? And is the contract in isolation really sufficient? Well, the answer to that, I think, quite clearly is no. And in a world where the levels of complexity, where the uncertainties that we're dealing with, I mean, look at the US election and the impact that's having on the world of trading relationships. Look at initiatives or issues such as Brexit and the challenges that's creating to the European Union. look at the shift and changes, the unpredictability of the regulatory environment. We're dealing more and more with an environment of real growth of complexity and uncertainty. Yet we're also dealing with a world where the levels of interdependency between organizations are growing, not only at a global level, even at a national level, as more and more companies place strong reliance on a complex supply network in order to deliver their promised results, goals to either the public in the public sector environment or to their customers in an ordinary customer environment. And we know from our research and data that traditional methods of dealing with that complexity through disconnected contracting activity fails. We know that on average companies erode some the equivalent of 9.2% of their annual revenue through weaknesses in the way they actually manage those trading relationships. A couple of big reasons for that. One is certainly that the users of contracts today can't actually understand them. Some 88% of contract users say that they find contracts difficult or impossible to understand. Clearly a major source of risk, particularly if you're relying on those users having to read the contract to know what they're trying to do. 83% similarly think that the overall contracting process doesn't help them to do their job. So the value erosion is scarcely surprising. And as we look at the underlying causes for much of this, it is very clear from our research that the companies that are making effective and intelligent investment in technology are soaring far and away above their competition in the quality of the performance they're achieving. The majority at the moment really still have failed to adopt technology in the contract management process in any meaningful way. While a significant portion certainly today have contract repositories, very, very few have really implemented a true, coherent, worldwide process, and certainly very few have really given thought to how does this effectively bind together these complex supply ecosystems and networks that today we depend upon. So let's move across and hear the story about how this could be so different.
So for starters, most organizations spend between 30 and 70% of their revenues procuring third-party goods and services. It should come as no surprise that this level of expenditure represents a very significant opportunity if managed effectively, as well as a significant amount of risk if left unmanaged. When you think about the end-to-end sourcing and source-to-pay lifecycle, we often see gaps in how the process is managed, the roles and responsibilities within the process, and the technology that supports it. In the face of continued cost and profitability pressures across all industries, constant change, increasing reliance on suppliers across almost every industry, it's imperative that organizations are not only identifying the right suppliers, but ensuring that the contracts and the supplier management processes that support these relationships can stand up to the business realities and the complexities. Otherwise, ineffective or disconnected supplier management and contract management practices lead to lost value, to mention the erosion of 9% from a revenue perspective of ineffective contracts. That lost value can also be measured in terms of overall cost, quality, time, or risk. Today we're going to dive into some of these topics in more detail and talk about understanding the importance of supplier selection, the integration of supplier management and the contracting process, how we transition from the contract to the contract award, onboarding suppliers in the post-award administration activities, how do we improve visibility in an environment of constant change, and ultimately what the important role of technology is underlying all of this. So Constantine, specifically, what are some of the challenges that companies are facing?
Yeah, Chris, this is part of the reason what brings us to the discussion points today is understanding this relationship between contracting and supplier management has really been a difficult one, and there are several reasons for this. That, you know, these are just some of the things that we've come up with, and from our respective experiences, and why this is true. In one context, sourcing and supplier selection decisions often made are done in isolation and done in silos, and as a result, we create a duplication of efforts that increases cost and could potentially damage corporate brands because you know, this disconnect happens, and this disruption can sometimes be immeasurable. Sourcing criteria also is not always translated into contracts, so there's no harmony between the two systems of sourcing records and contract records, and thus the processes that are managed between their respective owners is disconnected as it relates to the supplier. The disconnect between supplier contract creation and supplier onboarding also creates a lack of holistic visibility, whereby the relationships or the validations necessary to manage the two processes aren't in sync. So think about the problem of trying to onboard a supplier or create a contract when a supplier is not onboarded, which is something that could be a very critical validation. The handoff to contract owners is also not consistent or effective, and oftentimes this is really due to the lack of proper workflows that is not embedded to correctly manage them, particularly when you're dealing with complex processes. Supplier risk and performance is not effectively managed by the business. So with any third-party entity, we often think there's hundreds and hundreds of documents that are often created. In some cases, some people think the average number is about 1,500 pieces of data associated with a particular party. How do you manage that if you don't have proper processes and technology in place to do that? Finally, separate systems often hold supplier information, contract data, supplier performance, and spend. And with supplier information, it's not unusual to even alone have more than 5 different systems to manage supplier information, let alone all the other systems that could be in place for trying to manage the relationship and transactions that occur with those suppliers. Finally, the inability to effectively track ongoing contract performance once a contract is put in place creates a difficulty in managing obligations post-contract, and is most often unknown or underestimated in terms of understanding the obligations that are being met. So again, we could see that there's this huge disconnect between the two. So how do we rectify and try to manage that better through processing technology in a way that can give better visibility to ensure that that handoff is in place? So Chris, I'm going to turn this back over to you to talk about some of the processes and what we've seen and what we've experienced.
Yeah, absolutely. And building on the challenges, Constantine, that you just went through, the first place to start is to think about this as really as an overall integrated process. The terms source to pay or procure to pay, commonly used, but rarely people stop to consider what it means to have truly an integrated view. In today's world, the payment side, in many cases, can be very much automated and tied in through systems. If the front-end contract and if the purchase order is set up correctly. But there still exists a gap between selecting the right supplier, creating the contract with that supplier, and then managing not only the contract, but that supplier as well, including both from a performance and risk perspective. A quote that I heard Tim say many years ago that I've used often is that the risk doesn't start until the contract is executed. Many organizations spend their time and energy drafting and negotiating contracts, but it really falls off after that in terms of how the contract is managed post-award, the way the suppliers are managed relative to that contract. And this is where we see significant opportunities. What you see in the slide, 5 basic steps: selecting suppliers, managing suppliers, and contracts. Below the chevrons, you see a typical group of stakeholders involved in each of the processes, and while this may look a little different within your respective organizations, the point remains that there are a number of players involved at the various steps. If the activities and processes aren't tightly integrated, the effectiveness of the process will significantly suffer. A few points to note specifically. Number 1, due diligence and supplier selection needs to be cross-functional. It needs to address risk and how that service, how that contract, how that supplier ultimately will be managed. Robust contracts that have a well-defined scope, clearly defined activities, performance measurements, clear terms, should outweigh the use of standard form templates. Too often, too much time is spent in negotiating and finalizing these form templates rather than what the true spirit of the negotiation and what the contract is. Tim said earlier that these are economic means, not contractual means. They're not legal means. Contract performance plans should establish and be used to formally transition from procurement to the contract owner. And finally, looking across all facets, the contract, the supplier risk and performance need to be accessible by the business, by that front line of defense who ultimately is going to be responsible for managing those suppliers and those contracts. When you think about selecting the right supplier, the old adage was striking a balance between cost, quality, and time. Or in other words, you can't have something fast, good, and cheap. You can only have two of the three. If you want it fast, which would be time, it will not be cheap, or the quality won't be as good. Same holds true for the other components. As the procurement function and the sourcing strategies have evolved, as well as the complexity of the environment that we operate in, you've added components of risk which now be considered and weighed in every decision. Risk can be defined by any number of buckets, including compliance, operational, financial, the list goes on. The impact and likelihood of those risks needs to be understood and addressed. Additionally, you have things like innovation, things like supplier relationships that now also need to be considered and factored in. And these differentiating factors will be extremely important going forward as you consider not only the contract and the suppliers that you're selecting, but how they're ultimately managed. However, these are not just part of the sourcing process. They also need to flow all the way through the life cycle into how that supplier is viewed and how it is ultimately managed from a business perspective. Moving to the next step of the process, authoring and negotiating a contract as well as managing that post-award administration. You can have a variety of players involved, including procurement, sometimes legal, perhaps various subject matter experts like information security, compliance, finance. Hopefully the business is actually involved as well. But this involvement isn't always consistent and the dots are always not connected between the contract, onboarding the supplier, and managing that contract post-award. Not using the supplier information and the master data gathered during the sourcing can create gaps in necessary information that should reside within the contract, a mistranslation of what's important to monitor, or particularly who is responsible for managing that contract. If you were to take a poll of the companies represented on this webinar, I would bet that for those who have a contract lifecycle management system or even a basic contract repository, a significant majority have an identified contract owner for every contract in the system. I would also bet that many of those contract owners are either not aware of their prestigious designation or they don't have a clue as to what is required of them. Countless hours and company resources were spent drafting the expensive contract. Lawyers on both sides adding language to prove their merits of their education, but there was no clear handoff or accountability to managing that said contract. This represents a significant risk and issue as well as lost opportunity. Instead, as previously mentioned, a process needs to be connected end to end, clearly defining the handoff at each point, taking advantage of the workflow of the master data to link the activities, provide the validation between the supplier profile, the resulting contracts. Using things like I previously mentioned, a contract performance plan to summarize and define what needs to be measured in the contract and who is responsible for measuring it. Once the contract is done, now the fun begins. You actually have to live with the deal that you've constructed to manage that supplier, and not only their performance, but also ongoing risk exposure. Managing performance is a little more straightforward and one area that companies can typically start first, particularly when dealing with goods. Services-based contracts, services-based supplier performance can be a little more challenging, especially if the contract is not well written, does not have a clearly defined scope, objectives, deliverables, service level agreements, or the associated teeth to enforce the contract. On the risk side, it's not enough to just conduct a risk assessment during due diligence. Risks exist every day that we conduct business, and we need to constantly monitor and manage against those risks. but there are gaps in the process. Number one, the risk is either not factored in to the ongoing monitoring. Number two, ownership of that supplier risk often falls between the chairs or between the lines of responsibility, not clearly identifying who that particular owner is. Pockets of risk and exposure exist and are typically managed within silos in the organization, not easily understood. There's not a clear picture across the organization. Standalone solutions typically have been unable to connect the dots between the supplier, the risk, the performance, and the associated contract. So how do you deal with these challenges? Well, first, understanding and accepting that we live in an environment of constant change. There needs to be a clear link between the contract owner, the supplier relationship owner, and active management in these areas. The contract itself isn't enough to rely on in the environment where you've signed a contract that is not the same as the environment tomorrow. Visibility of supplier and contract needs to include end-to-end point of view, as discussed previously. All facets of that contract, supplier, risk, and performance need to be accessible by the business. Those that are on the front line and responsible for managing that contract and managing that performance of the supplier. It requires synchronization and visibility across people, processes, and ultimately technology. And to do this, organizations will need to rely on exception management so it's scalable. They need to rely on dynamic workflows that are based on either event or milestone-driven activities. Specifically, there are a number of ways that you can optimize the supplier management and contract management in the context of technology. Let's turn to Constantine to hear more about that.
Sure, thanks, Chris. So without getting too technical here, it's really important to understand how do we optimize supplier management and contract management in the context of a technology approach. In this, it's important that we understand the relationships, which also includes the transactions, understanding that commerce happens between two parties. The ability to holistically tie these efforts is critical to optimize the relationship. So how do you do this? One way is understanding it from a platform approach, using a single master database that can manage these relationships in very distinct ways. And the approach that we often look at is really kind of a three-pronged one. One would be to understand this relationship in the context of document management. Document management can be used to enable to track, manage, and store documents and reduce the paper-using workflows, as we talked about with contract and related documents. And thereby, we can enable the capability of keeping a record of various versions created and modified by different users, ensuring that we have history tracking within one system. We also can do this from a metadata management standpoint, which is really the oversight of the data associated with the data assets that we're using to ensure that information can be integrated, accessed, shared, linked, analyzed, and even maintained to the best effect across the entire organization. Finally, and as Chris had mentioned too, we're dealing with master data. In this case, we're dealing with technology-enabled disciplines in which businesses and the business and the IT can work together to ensure that we're creating some type of uniformity and accuracy, stewardship, and semantic consistency and accountability of the enterprise's official data so that we can create some kind of harmony in terms of the trade-off and the relationships that happen. And now what I'm going to do is just show you some examples of how we can do this with this three-pronged approach. In one case, supplier information management, SIM if you will, and contract data elements can be centralized so that when you are creating supplier information with contracts and sourcing, SIM metadata can be created directly for other elements relating to those suppliers. By doing this, we can provide the unique possibility to manage SIM globally and locally and being able to share this information across a common platform. This data management improves drastically the process by avoiding many re-entries of information and really guarantees the compliance by providing better data accuracy across the complete life cycle. Another example of this is by the ability to collect information through supplier questionnaires. So through questionnaires, whether onboarding or reinforcing policy and procedure for compliance, using the data elements collected in these processes for collecting supply information can be used from anything when we're sourcing the suppliers for event management or converting this information into contract elements that directly correspond when you're dealing with contracts post-award. Moreover, facilitating this through supplier self-service using supplier portals or supplier network really reduces the redundancies of asking the supplier multiple times for the same information and thereby improving the efficiency in addition to the data integrity that we're looking for in the supplier to contract handoff. Another area that we've certainly emphasized as part of this discussion is also the idea of workflow and the importance of workflow. Having the ability to create multi-level workflows provides a dynamic means to emphasize the state of contract onboarding and processes related from internal or even external parties. Having a great UI UX features is important. Workflow must be truly a core feature of any application in the process, and by being able to create automatic design through navigation and clearly stating what steps you're in, whether you're authoring, collaborating, validating, creating signatures, and even the sub-processes creates that instant, clear, distinct steps and allows you to improve the governance of that process. Moreover, as you create much better visual workflows, it improves the ability to create the ability to manage the processes in contract, even as far as creating the social elements of content cards, knowing where you are at any point in process and knowing who those points of contacts are as part of those workflows. Another example of this is really around the flexibility and the adaptability of workflows based on the data. Being able to adjust workflows based on various types of elements creates a better improvement in terms of the automation and how data and workflows can be adjusted. This is often where transaction aspects of the supplier and contracts matter. Understanding what changes happen in real time to understand how purchases or requests for quote, for instance, can change the mandate from what is being bought against the contract and from which supplier or what category we're dealing with. Being able to manually trigger this process after modifications ensures visibility into areas like rebate recognition, for meeting the terms and conditions that were agreed upon in the contract, and for ensuring that savings that were both identified as part of the sourcing process can now be realized as part of contracting. Actions can then be initiated by event-driven information to initiate actions such as things like commodity changes or other types of data like I have demonstrated here. Finally, another area of creating improved visibility is really being able to easily establish the access to contracts from supplier profiles. As I had mentioned earlier, oftentimes these are done in different siloed systems, but having them in a unified approach creates the ability to unify the supplier contacts, supplier links to any types of transactions, surveys related to the suppliers, or certifications and contract dashboards. So having the ability to easily access the contract repository for all of the contracts related to that supplier improves this visibility, as well as any type of certifications or types of documentation that need to be in place in order to ensure that the supplier is compliant with certain processes and procedures that might relate back to regulatory requirements. Finally, in conclusion, on the risk mitigation, as we know, data is not static, and organizations are constantly in motion with regard to their suppliers. As such, you need a dynamic way to bring all the steps in touch with suppliers and their contracts together in the context of procurement and risk management. So do you have an approach that can automatically manage the onboarding in workflow, be able to take a look at the certification and compliance mechanisms in place, be able to easily address purchasing contract repositories, and even tie those back to the purchasing and payment validations that are needed in order to ensure that the contracts are in sync and that you are in compliance with the requirements and terms and conditions. By being able to do this in a holistic way, you accelerate the validation, onboarding, and contract approvals. You prevent the onboarding of unauthorized suppliers or non-compliant supplier contracts. You create deeper audit-level insights that creates new clarity into supplier and contract workflows. You're able to easily access risk exposure based on contracts affiliated with third parties, create direct access points for further supplier information, contract discovery and analysis, and finally, overall, reduce the cost and duplication of managing supplier information and data. So these are just some examples from a technology framework that could help you make that connection between that supplier and contract. And now, as Chris will highlight, we're going to show some real-world examples of how processes and technology come together to really solve the real issues centralized around compliance and in some cases regulation, and where SIM and CLM are essential. So Chris, let's talk through some of these challenges that we've seen in the real world.
Yeah, thanks, Constantine. Just to briefly take a look at a couple of real-life examples, as you mentioned. The first one is from an oil and gas company with operations across the globe. In addition to not having visibility of their contracts or being able to tie back performance requirements and obligations of their suppliers, they were also faced with challenges complying with Anti-Corruption and Foreign Corrupt Practices Act requirements. Specifically, tracking and having visibility to contracts and dealings with government officials, and tracking foreign business through agents, distributors, and freight forwarders. The process, which was enabled through a robust set of business rules and workflow, included milestones and checkpoints on the front end to ensure that not only was the right level of due diligence applied prior to a contract being signed, making sure that the right provisions and contract terms were included in the contract based on the spend category, type of contract, and other attributes, and then linked to a standard set of performance requirements and ongoing monitoring activities that were then pushed to the business stakeholders, also including procurement and legal. So really tying, again, that end-to-end process and pushing out that role and that clarity to the front line that was responsible for doing the management. At the end of the day, the company was able to not only ensure 100% compliance with the process, but also automate many of the steps and activities that previously consumed multiple people and a lot of time and resources to perform, freeing them up to do much more strategic activities. Another example is with a healthcare provider and challenges that they had in dealing with Stark Law compliance. Stark Law is a set of laws within the U.S. that prohibit a referral by a physician of a Medicare or Medicaid patient to an entity providing health services if that physician has a financial relationship with said entity. There are a number of exceptions to this rule, but certainly one that all healthcare providers are well aware of the regulations, and many are struggling to come up with scalable solutions to solve it. Non-compliance can result in denial of payment, in some cases refunding money and penalties to the provider. To manage this, contracts between physicians and hospitals must fit within several regulations and safe harbors to fully alleviate the violations. While the process can be managed in a manual fashion, and many providers are still doing so, it's difficult to monitor and to enforce the requirements, as well as to maintain accurate records without the use of robust and integrated systems, including contract management systems, supplier performance, and information management systems. Additionally, many of the front-end requirements around credentialing and fair market value analysis, as well as other steps, further complicate the matter. For this particular company, through a combination of clearly defined policies and procedures, clear delineation of roles and responsibilities, including pre-contracting, due diligence, contracting, post-award, as well as the use of smart forms and workflow, integration with the PO and payment systems, as well as integrated reporting, the company was able to implement not only a scalable solution and very robust solution, but one that allowed them to manage the entire physician contracting lifecycle from initial screening all the way through contract expiration. So to wrap up, and we certainly want to leave some time for Q&A on the back end, We've covered a lot of points on the webinar. We've thrown a lot of information at you and why it's important to link sourcing and supplier selection to how contracts are created, how contracts are ultimately managed, how the suppliers are managed with an end-to-end view. Aligning processes, organization, as well as the underlying systems and data. And by not doing so, having disconnected supplier management and contract management practices can lead to the lost value, whether that's measured by cost, quality, time, Tim mentioned on the front end, revenue leakage, or the increased risk exposure. The measurement is significant. The simple message here is that there's not a single answer. There's multiple ways to achieve the reality that Constantine and I have laid out. Regardless of where you are in the continuum, there's always room for improvement. Companies that are at the early stage of adoption can start simply by establishing standard processes, connectivity between the processes and the organization, and basic reporting and management of master metadata. The initial focus typically in that case is around performance management from a supplier standpoint. As companies mature, they later move into more standardized processes, more robust processes, use of dashboards, and typically more advanced technology, while then starting to consider the elements of risk in terms of managing that supplier relationship. As you move then further up the maturity curve, there are those companies that really start to manage that combination of performance and risk and link that to the overall value to the organization. These companies tend to have a much greater adoption of integrated systems. They are able to link the processes end-to-end, as we've talked about, and create a market advantage out of that supply base, as well as taking advantage and maximizing the opportunity provided by those contracts. So with that, as I said, we want to leave some time for Q&A. Definitely want to thank you for your time today, and we'll open it up for questions.
Maybe you could pick up any questions. One of the obvious ones, of course, always is, are we going to get a copy of this presentation? And like we said at the beginning, everybody will, of course, be sent a link, so you will have the opportunity to get back and listen to this again or share it with others in your business.
There's one out there that says, I realize this presentation is about how technology can improve the contract lifecycle, but do you also need to have category management implemented to manage the categories and their contracts end to end?
Yeah, I'll take this one, Chris. Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to Chris's point before about, different people are at different points in their life cycle, but having a category management system in place is part of managing the upstream process with sourcing and having an optimized strategic sourcing effort is critical to making sure you're picking and managing the right forms of categories and that you could be best enabled with. As we had talked about earlier, product is definitely one area, with services being more complicated. But as part of this process, it really kind of goes back, from our experience, it goes back to the data and the workflow, and knowing what categories you're trying to optimize, using maybe the Pareto principles here to understand which are the biggest impacted categories that we should be pursuing in very classical, sourcing approaches and category management approaches. But once you have that down, taking the process and taking the steps to ensure that you know which contracts you're trying to manage and not trying to swallow the ocean, so to speak, this becomes then a repetitive model and is something that, again, knowing where the lowest hanging fruit is, it might be the good approach, but then also knowing where some of your greatest risks are. In particular, this is part of the reason why we chose some of the case studies that Chris called out as well, in terms of compliance with Corrupt Practices Act, and then dealing with Stark Law, just two regulations or two areas that we've experienced as being one of the largest reasons for trying to automate both supplier management and contract management. So to answer your question, yes, that's a starting point, but that should not, if you don't have a mature category management effort, that should not stop you from pursuing and trying to automate and manage these processes through the current processes you have. So Chris, I don't know if you have
Yeah, Constantine, I'll pile on just slightly there. So, I mean, category management certainly is a leading practice, and there's a number of studies out there that show that without category management, the benefits and savings from a traditional strategic sourcing program will start to erode. Sourcing is typically event-focused, individual demand. You know, maybe within a year, you may be signing 3-year deals, but a much shorter term horizon than category management that may be 1, 3, 5 years out, looking at more macro views and trends, industry drivers, cost drivers, competition. So certainly category management helps drive the overall sourcing strategy. It sets up optimal ways to structure contracts, gives some insight into how those contracts can be, I think, more aligned with not only the trends of that particular category, but the needs of the business. So certainly there is a vast array of benefits from category management. To your point, it's not needed to get things off the ground. I would consider that much more a median to leading practice type of environment.
If I could just add to that briefly, I think yes, you're really indicating that this is in many ways a quite independent area of decision. And one of the things I think that unfortunately we often see as a weakness on the client side particularly is a failure to have actually thought not about categories of product or service, but categories of contract type. And one of the more mature and critical areas is really to think around what's the portfolio of relationships that I need within my business, ranging from obviously the simple purchase order right the way through to complex outsourcing agreements or whatever. And do I really have that right portfolio, and have I automated and developed technology that's going to enable me to manage across my portfolio of relationship types as well as relative to the nature of the products or services that I'm actually acquiring. So, I think that, if you like, that dual segmentation is certainly typical of the most sophisticated organizations and really delivers the maximum benefit.
Are there other questions that have come through?
How long would it take for a company to move from initial stage to proactive strategic stage, including survey period? Can you provide a very high level without too much details how this integrates into other systems and what is needed?
Yeah, I mean, we could probably spend a day talking through that. So let me address the front end of that first, and then we can see about the second piece. So, the classic response is, of course, it depends. On a number of factors, and probably too many to go through on this call. It's certainly not an overnight shift, and typically looking at it, if you take the maturity level concept in mind, you're not jumping from an initial or ad hoc to a proactive or what would be considered industry standard. It's an evolution moving up the ladder and up the continuum. And it can evolve at different speeds. So if you take that maturity and think about whether it's people, process, technology, or you expand that further into strategy and process and organization, reporting, and systems, those things may evolve at different rates, but ultimately they've got to come up to a consistent level for everything to be effective. Somewhat dodging the question because it depends on so many factors. I would say that it is probably more, at a minimum, it's more than a year's journey to get there, even for small organizations to truly get there, including the implementation of systems. It can be much longer than that for larger organizations. So it depends on quite a number of things.
Yeah, and to add to that, I think it also shows that depending upon how many systems you already have in place, what's been the history of the organization in trying to consolidate, and as we had mentioned, assuming that you have one system to try to bring this all together, most organizations don't, and so what you need to consider is the flexibility in how do you get information that can work together, right? How do you try to consolidate processes as much as possible, where having some sense of uniformity between the supplier management and CLM, going down the path to saying maybe we should have this in one common system, or looking at P2P as part of that and saying how do we combine those data elements. And I think that has a lot of impact then in terms of how quickly you can get those processes enabled. So that's again where the technology aspect comes into play. But to piggyback off of Chris's comment, again, it depends. And there's not, I guess, one way to solve this problem.
What was the second part of the question?
High level, without too much detail, how this integrates into one system as one needs.
Constantine, you want to take a stab at that?
Yeah, sure. Again, I think it goes back to what we were saying before. Is how does this integrate into one system? It depends on what you already have in place. And one of the things that we've experienced quite a bit here at Determine is that most organizations have kind of started the journey with a siloed approach. And so oftentimes we've seen organizations have separate supplier, or maybe even leveraging supplier risk with a GRC approach. Looking at CLM because they had to onboard it for sales or procurement separately, or legal had their own reasons for buying and contract management. And the way that we're seeing to try to solve this problem now is by really considering taking this kind of three-pronged approach, as I had mentioned earlier on the call, with trying to manage master data, metadata, and process, and trying to unify that. And so what we're seeing is a lot of organizations are kind of in this, if you want to call it, post-ERP environment, where they're saying the systems that they feel that they have in place aren't adequate enough, particularly because of the disconnect between workflows, the inability to get one single source of truth of suppliers, or the ability to clearly hand that off. And so what we're seeing is organizations now taking that on because they recognize they need to start maybe looking at a new technology way or new technology approach to improve those processes. And so we're seeing that a lot of organizations are beginning their journey to start doing this and to try to improve in terms of creating some uniformity in the organization.
So if I may just sort of summarize in our last minute or so, and I apologize for the erratic nature of connection. Of course, in many ways, this webinar being delivered in a global context from Chris in India, Constantine, you in the US, from me in Australia, is a great illustration of this challenge that we face of maintaining connectivity in this interdependent world. And contracts, as I was mentioning before, are absolutely paramount in that activity, increasingly recognized no matter what part of the world you're looking at as being this fundamental linkage. But if we do not have the underlying technology that gives them meaning and that simplifies the extrapolation of data, the ability to monitor and oversee performance, we will continue to see very substantial economic losses, as well as, of course, underperforming supply relationships and supply networks. So what we've been talking about today is a critical step forward for organizations, and there is, as I mentioned earlier, in our benchmark data, very clear evidence that those who are making this investment are really establishing a significant competitive advantage. Technology in the contract management area is absolutely no longer optional. It is something that is critical to business survival. So I hope that in the messages today you've managed to see and hear how this is really spreading into being a true process-based activity rather than something that is perhaps just sub-elements of that overall process getting some level of automation. It really is, I think, an exciting time for our community, but one where it's absolutely timely for us to make the next steps. So, Chris, Constantine, thank you so much for your presentation today and for those excellent examples and case studies. And Chris, I wish you good travels, and Constantine, I hope that you whatever you decide, have success in your election.
Yeah, and also thank you so much. Thank you guys, and for those of us that are stateside, don't forget to vote today. Today is November 8th, and thank you everybody for joining us again, and we look forward to doing more of these in the future.